Hello, today is February 20th, 2013, and you are listening to I Think You Think, a podcast that puts a new spin on debate and discussion. I'm Justin, and on the other side of my computer screen is James.
Hello, folks.
Yay, James! And we are your hosts at Carry No Credentials for Coding. I Think You Think is a podcast that focuses on what we, your hosts, think, but also what you think. Too many times we spend debates and discussions talking past one another and not enough time trying to learn and understand why someone thinks what they think. This is what makes I Think You Think different, because we are focused on why people think the way that they do and why we think the way that we do. James and I believe that the forum of ideas should be open to everyone, and everyone should have the opportunity to challenge and be challenged by ideas. We are not here to pass judgment, but merely discuss ideas and topics. This podcast, first and foremost, is a conversation between us and hopefully you. Feel free to email us, follow us on Facebook for future podcasts, and follow us on Tumblr for links relevant to this podcast and all of our other podcasts. The links for each of these can be found in the underbar of this video. I Think You Think is produced by StolenArts Productions and is recorded live at Fisher International Studios. How are you doing today, James?
I'm doing well, a little cold, but beyond that, I feel like I am doing very well. Yourself?
Like a cold as in like the sickness cold, or like
Chilly,
oh, okay.
chilly.
I'm the I am opposite one. I actually have a cold. I feel the second time I've been sick while we've been doing a podcast. Man, I'm a sick person. I used to not always get sick. Now I always get sick. Oh,
It's just the stress of all these listeners and, all these people listening to us. There's a lot of pressure. You four people who have been listening on a regular basis need to just back off a little bit with all your responses and your commenting on everything and all your oh wait, no, none of that ever happened. Never mind.
but that's okay. I'm sure that
It is fine.
there are those out there who are listening and not commenting. But
Definitely.
you should comment and you should like the videos because it makes us feel good about ourselves, and that's the only reason we do it, is so that we can feel good about ourselves.
We're American, self-gratification,
That's exactly it. It's basically like verbal masturbation.
which was the original title of this podcast. That is not at all true.
Anyway, as you may have noticed, or maybe you haven't, maybe you don't care, but my audio probably sounds a little funny. I am using one of my old headsets because I couldn't get I could get the nice microphone out that I use, but the place where I normally record, the dining room, is currently filled up with several suitcases and things being packed because we leave for our trip in 6 days. We leave on Tuesday next week. So then you guys will be able to get all caught up on our podcasts.
We will rearrange time so it works again.
Yes. But yeah, so that's why and such like of the people. All right, so we have a couple of topics. They're not really specific topics. They're kind of general, so we're not exactly sure where they are going to go. And the first one that we are going to start off with is the very broad topic of death. So let's start off with James. What age were you at, and what was it in which you first encountered either the idea or actually come into contact specifically with death?
Well, my mom has been into animal rescue, focusing mainly on dogs. I mean, not so much now that she's older, but throughout my youth and when I was in high school and even in my 20s, and even now, some of the dogs she owns, are definitely her taking them in is, you know, uh, I don't want to say it's a burden, but she has some dogs that other people probably wouldn't, like they kind of end up with her. And just her experience with these sorts of things allows it, um, allows her to be able to take care of or live with these dogs, without it being an issue that it would be with someone who had less experience. So I still remember being maybe 6 or 7 or 8. It's, hard to differentiate after so many years. Um, but my mom coming in and telling me that she had to put our dog Swede to sleep, who was, um, my dog. He was a black lab. I was originally born in Connecticut, and that dog moved from Connecticut to here with us, in like 1977 or something like that. So it was a long time ago. Um, and that's the first time I remember sort of um, knowing, that things die. I'm sure I experienced it before because I don't think it's the first dog we had lost as I was growing up. But then, throughout my youth, say I was 7 at that point, I'm really not sure. Um, over the next, 11 years, as I traveled to the age of 18, we had many pets that came and went. Because a lot of rescue, sometimes a decent portion of it is getting older dogs or ill dogs. It's a sad reality that when dogs get old and more difficult or costly to take care of is a lot of times uh, the point at which certain families get rid of animals. It happens. Not all families do, but it does happen. So, by the time I actually had someone who was really close to me start passing away, I had sort of experienced that cycle of life to a degree already in many ways. I mean, in addition to having pets pass away, I had literally seen multiple litters, many litters of dogs and or kittens, whether it was one of my mom bred Chihuahuas for a brief period of time, Whippets for a short while. And every now and again, a pregnant dog is a dog that sometimes needs a home because people don't want to deal with puppies or they don't want to deal with kittens, or just in being a stray for a short while. The animals will get pregnant just because they're out there with the other strays in the world. So I had seen, from the moment of birth all the way through death in a way, many, many times. By the time it actually hit home, the first time I remember a human passing, I remember 3 of my 4 grandparents passed in basically a year span, but I hadn't seen any of them for several years, and I knew they were declining. So it was kind of sort of distant, and they were older, and it was kind of expected, and it was just, okay, it finally happened kind of situation. Um, but the first time I had someone who was actually close to me and near, I had a friend of mine, Alma, who passed away. She was about 34. This is probably 12 years ago now. I was actually training for a new job, and I got the call at work. This is back when I didn't have a cell phone. I mean, this is a long enough time ago that I didn't. Um, and that was like having someone disappear like that um, was very. I mean, it was very upsetting, obviously. But it puts everything in perspective for me. Just having someone be there one day, gone the next. Um, and I guess those are my 3 kind of phases of experiencing death. The third being by far the hardest. What
Okay.
about for yourself?
The my earliest memory that I have being touched by death in any regard was my grandfather dying. This I was again. I couldn't tell you exactly how old I was. I know that I was at school, so I must have been at least in kindergarten, um, or first or second grade. It was after preschool, I remember. But I still have some memories of my grandfather being around. He was pretty old. He really didn't move around very much. The house that I grew up in had an apart. the basement was basically a finished basement, but it was an older house, so like it wasn't finished with uh, um, like typical the kind of it's not a finished basement in the type of suburban homes that you see nowadays. It was
Right.
finished with stone and brick and tile floors, but it had a kitchen and it had two bedrooms and it had a full bathroom. But it was like a little apartment. It even had an entrance in from the outside where you didn't have to go in through the house. So I mean, this was a little older house in the suburbs in Ohio, where I grew up. But anyway, so my grandmother, my grandfather lived down there, and he had been getting on. He was about 18 years older than my grandmother, and so he was getting older. I remember it was getting hard for him to get around because he had hurt himself one time. He had tripped over my fire truck and had fallen on it. And I remember because there was this very telltale bruise on his leg from where he fell. So, I mean, he wasn't getting around very well. So we kind of knew it was coming, but I wasn't old enough to really understand. I know that I used to go down and one of his favorite things to do was to take saltine crackers and butter them. From stories I've heard, I remember eating buttered saltine crackers with him. But from stories I heard, because I only vaguely remember eating them with him, we used to talk, but I don't remember any of those conversations. However, my first experience with death, which is this whole story, what I'm cutting to, I had come home from school. I think I was in kindergarten or first grade, and my mom had said that an ambulance had come and taken Grandpa away, and I understood that to mean because I think I must have asked, when is he coming back? Because they had said he's not. I don't recall whether or not anybody explained to me like the whole concept of what it means that he's gone, but I do recall going outside, sitting down on the stoop that led down into the basement apartment where my grandmother and grandfather lived, and crying. I can't recall the feelings I had as a child when that happened, but I remember that happening. I just don't remember how I felt and why I felt like I needed to cry about it. But I do remember crying. Um, Now looking back on it, the memories are so old I can't even recall the feelings that I had about my grandfather, and so it doesn't drum up any kind of real emotion about
Right. Right.
it. I had my share of pets that died. I had a dozen or so gerbils and hamsters and things like that. And those types of animals, while they're interesting and fun to kind of have, they definitely don't develop the same sort of emotional attachment that you get from dogs and cats. Those become much more a member of your family. And so when they died, it was more just like, okay, that's kind of inconvenient. Now I need to go out and bury them or do something with their body. Whereas when, like you were telling me this story, because I didn't have a dog when I was growing up, I had cats, but they eventually all ended up like living outside, and so it was more just we didn't see that cat around anymore, and so we just assumed it was gone. Um, so I had not friends but acquaintances as I was growing up in like high school. I remember there was a kid that I knew who had died in a car accident, um, but I didn't know him well enough, and so I never really had any feelings about it. Honestly, I have to say my first, and this is really weird because I used to always tell people that I never had anybody close to me die, and they used to say, "Oh, well, when it happens, it'll be like the world comes to an end for you." And so my first real experience with death was when my grandmother passed away. And this only happened, oh, let's see, maybe 5 years ago at the most. Um, And so I was in my mid 20s was the very first time that anybody close to me ever passed away. Um,
Right.
I got a unique um, you know I got a unique kind of experience out of it, only in the sense that, one, I'm generally emotionally mature enough to kind of deal with how I feel about it. I'm emotionally mature enough that I can recognize that I'm upset about something, and I don't feel ashamed to cry about it or anything. Um, and so it wasn't like an awkward time for me in which I was struggling with how I felt about it. I could just express how I felt about it. The one thing that I love, if one can really have this, that I cherish about the fact about how my grandmother passed, is that she was getting sicker. We knew it was only a matter of days. I live in Illinois, and they live in Ohio, um, and I had a couple of choices. One, I could take some vacation time and go out and see her before she passed away, or I could wait until she passed away and then take funeral leave and go home for her funeral. I made the decision to go ahead and and wait until she passed away to take the time off. But that didn't stop me. I called her. We talked on the phone. I got the unique opportunity to say my goodbyes to the person who was dying. I got to tell her that I would miss her. I got to tell her that I would tell my kids about her. I got to express to her how important she was to me, how I'll never forget her. Um, and not a lot of people get that. Not a lot of people get that opportunity. The people that they care about either just up and die, or the process is slow and there's a mental breakdown and they never get that opportunity. But with my grandmother, I got that opportunity, and that's one of the things that I'll always cherish. Um, but with talking with my mom, I'm actually very happy that I made the decision I did, because for me, my last memories of my grandmother, while I know she was getting older and she wasn't getting around as well, are of a generally healthy woman. But I know in her last few weeks, she had gotten really bad and she was in this hospital bed. And those are the last memories that my brother has, that my mother has, of seeing her there, of identifying her, in the coroner's office, her on a slab in a freezer. Those are their last memories, and I don't have those. I don't have,
Right.
for me, she's still very much alive in my memories.
And that's the same way it is for me with my grandparents, honestly, because they lived so far away when they passed that it had been years since I'd seen them. And last time I'd seen them, they'd been in, I mean, they were old, but they were in relatively good health and had their faculties and everything.
Yeah, it's it's kind of a weird situation when you have a person that, I mean, I've cared very much. I still care very much about my grandmother. Um, as a person who doesn't believe that anything happens really after death. There's no spirit or anything to live on. I've told my wife, and I'll share this with you and the small community that listen to us. Um, I talk to my grandmother sometimes. I know she doesn't exist other than in my memory, and I recognize that it's really just me talking to myself. But it makes me feel good to think about the things that has happened. To think about my memories that I have of her. Um, and I feel like when my mom finally passes, I'll probably go through the same sort of thing. I'll be very sad. I will cry. Um, I bawled like a baby when at my grandmother's uh, memorial service, and but I will still have mental conversations with my mother. I'll still have mental conversations with my grandma. Do you ever experience that with your parents? The thinking about your grandparents?
Um, No, no, not that's not for me personally. I do have a lot of regret around those maybe last say 4 to 6 years that they were around. Because it was like my late teens, I believe, when they passed. It's hard to really place it, but that sounds about right. And I wasn't the kind of person, late teens, early 20s, I think, now that I'm really thinking about it. Um, but I wasn't the kind of person that was really appreciating my elders, we'll say. More typical self-involved 20-something-year-old, blah, blah, blah. Um, and I wish I would have taken the time to reach out, and have talked to them more. I mean, I lived so far away from them for almost my entire lives. I'd see them in the summers, and that was basically it. And and that ended sometime, in early high school, and then I only saw them a little bit after that, if at all. My dad's parents, it had probably been the better part of a decade since I'd seen them. I could be a little off on these numbers, but it's right around there. Less for my mom's parents, just because they lived in Florida, and I think I had made it down there. And then, of course, well, for my mom's mom, she actually lived up here after my grandfather on that side passed away. So I got to see her more often. But to really, take that opportunity to benefit from that wisdom and really kind of learn about, there's a lot of things I do know, but there's so much that I don't know. Um, but I mean, for me, no, I wish I had taken the time to know them a little bit better, especially, the times before, you know, like I knew them in the present, but I didn't know how they got there, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. I know that when we were preparing for my grandmother's memorial service, my grandmother was we had my she had made it clear in her will, and my mom and my grandmother had talked about it at length. I mean, she had been ailing for many years, so the conversation of what to do when she died had happened many times over. So, but she was cremated, um, and so there wasn't a funeral. It was just uh, there was just a memorial service for her, and so I remember when we were preparing for the memorial service, we were going through loads of old pictures from the time when my grandmother was, young, a child, the age of my son now. And my mom had obviously grown up with some stories that my grandmother, her mother, had told her about when she was a child. And so my mom was really the fountain of knowledge in regards to, well, who are these people in this picture? I mean, and and my mom didn't know all of them. And so here are these. He, keep in mind, you're talking to a person who I love the human narrative, the stories within, just about pictures. I love going to museums and looking at artifacts that were once held by people who don't exist and haven't existed for thousands of years. And so I'm talking to my mother about my grandmother and hearing this story about a woman who existed long before I was even before my parents even existed, and I didn't know this. Like, I had known that my grandmother was very active in her church, but I didn't know that there was a point at which she was a pastor at a church years ago. And we're talking early to mid 1900s, a woman being a pastor at a church.
Wow.
And I mean, it's so weird to think about now because my grandmother was she was much more conservative, and that was one of the things in which her and I would come to arguments later on in my in my walk in Christianity. When I started to become much more liberal, we would have our arguments. I mean, we still loved each other, and we could say, I still love you. We disagree, but but it's it's so weird to think about that she was a pastor of a church, and that's very not um, traditional. That's not very conservative. That's definitely a more liberal idea in the church nowadays. But she did this, in the 1930s, the 1940s. She drove buses for years um, in New York. That's where she uh, spent a very large majority of her life. That's where my parents were born. Were in New York. Um, and there's just these great amounts of tales of stories that are lost. I mean, for the most part, we don't know too much. One of my most treasured possessions I received from her, it was a Bible that it's a big old family Bible that was given to um, not a member specifically of my grandmother's family, but my grandmother had a stepmother, and it was uh, her stepmother's parents or something to that effect. That was their Bible originally, that was bestowed to Mr. and Mrs. Bixby in 1865, 1885. I'm sorry, and I own that Bible now. And that's just this another piece of history that I'm sure has loads of stories attached to it, but no one knows what they are.
That reminds me of when my mother's father had passed away. Like within the first couple of days, a lot of stories about him came up, and it was, I really wish that those stories would have come up years earlier, or when, he had like a series of heart attacks over the maybe a little over a year. I'm not exactly sure about the numbers, but around a year, and so it wasn't surprising when he did finally pass. Um, but one of the things that she told me, there's a couple that really stick out. He was a volunteer state policeman back in the 50s. And when he refused to carry a gun. He still did the job, but he refused to carry a gun because he said he would never, ever use it. And that always, stuck with me. Like, he's a volunteer state policeman, that's a serious thing to volunteer for.
Right.
Um, and then to put yourself in that position, but just refuse to carry the gun because, like, no matter what happens, I'm never going to use it. It just kind of stuck with me. And it said, I think both aspects of that say a lot about, his character and expand upon things I already knew about him as far as his character as a person. The one even more so, though, in the 50s, he used to go to the inner city and teach boxing or basketball. I always forget because originally I was told a story and it was wrong, and it's the other. But anyways, he taught sports to the inner city kids, the African American kids, in the 50s.
Right, which was huge.
He's a college professor, and to do that, being, yeah, it's totally huge. Those boundaries to him never existed, or they existed, but to him they were ridiculous. It made no sense. I don't even know if ridiculous is the right word. Like, he'd see that other people had the boundaries, but that didn't matter to him. He knew what was right, he knew what was wrong, and he acted on his own moral compass, which is more akin to, now 60 years later, what we're experiencing than what the real world was, for a professional white man in the 50s, and what they should or shouldn't be doing, you know, according to what society would expect, you know. But again, volunteering his time, to do that, to spend time. Um, just couple little stories that, I always knew that I loved my grandfather and that he was an awesome grandfather. But it wasn't until after he passed that I really learned that he was actually an incredibly awesome man. Like what he had done in his life, and, the rules he followed and the rules he ignored, that really sort of defined him as a person, just I wish I would have known sooner because as much as I love my grandfather, there's a lot of things I would have asked. Like what was it really like to do that? You know, um, who stood up against you, and who was timid at first but followed in your footsteps. And things like that. Just I probably like now at this stage, the person I am today, if I could go back, to a few years before he passed and be able to sit down, I could probably talk to him for a week straight, asking questions and hearing stories and things like that.
Well, I think we're gonna call this. This has been a good topic. It's always a good reminder to think about that. Our time here, this miraculous moment where our molecules come together and we get to exist in this universe is so short. It's so fleeting, and that we're surrounded by so many people with so many stories, and that it's worth it sometimes just to sit down and get a couple of those stories just to pass on. I mean, I've got a couple. I've got a few stories I'll be able to pass on to my kids about my grandmother, and hopefully they'll be able to take a few of those and pass them on to their kids. And in that sense, my grandmother is going to live on, and likewise, you've got stories that you'll be able to pass on to people around you, maybe ways that teachings that have been brought to you that you can then pass on, and in that sense your grandfather gets to live on, um, into in as for that's really one of our biggest bids for immortality, is just being able to pass on our stories. um, but yeah, I mean, that's a great topic. I kind of want to just keep going with it, but I also would like to wrap things up and then move on to our next topic. And for you guys, a couple of days. For us, just a couple of moments. Anything you want to touch on before we wrap this one up?
I just say that, going to my friend Alma that had passed away, it really, like enjoying your time with your friends and remembering your friends and your family and, taking a moment to remember what's actually important because our modern lifestyles do not highlight that at all. You have to force the hand of your life to, in most, for most people, to really bring those things to the forefront or make them important, because it's not it's not the way our society is geared to run anymore. Um, but make sure you're pushing for as much of that as you can get. Um, because you never know with anybody in your life. Do you have 2 weeks or 2 decades? You just don't know. You don't know. So make sure you're appreciating people and saying what you need to while they're here. And that's all I'd say. And for me, this is a really happy subject. Like I'm, just it's nice to think about and remember, these people that have passed that I really cared about, and it's heartwarming to remember these people for me.
Yeah, I would agree. Death doesn't necessarily have to be a sad thing. For me, at least, there are moments of sadness, but in general, lots of good things to think about regarding the people that are now gone. Um, so, all right, we'll see you guys in a couple of days. Remember to like the video, comment, either here on the video on YouTube or on our Facebook. Share it if you enjoy it. If you don't like it, please comment. Tell us what you didn't like. If you have questions, please also send us an email, comment. If you're interested in being a guest, also, please get in touch with James or I. Okay, thanks. We'll see you guys in a couple of days.